Well, it is 8 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, and I see people pouring in, but because I want to make sure we have lots of opportunity to discuss this very fascinating topic that I know is on the top of mind in all of the regions in which this Circle of Cleft Professionals is active, we'll jump right in. So welcome to this webinar. If this is your first time on Zoom, you can see on the bottom ribbon, there is a way of controlling your microphone and your video. There's even a chat feature, which some of you have figured out. You can either send chats to me, the host, or to everybody, and they'll appear off the side of your screen. When we get to the question and answer period and the discussion part near the end, you'd be encouraged to turn on your video if you have that capability. It's not required, but if you can, feel free to keep your video off while you're listening, whatever makes sense to you. It's lovely to see such a big turnout this morning. So if we go on to the next slide, Smriti, my colleague, is with me today, and we're helping to drive this webinar, making sure that we have no technical glitches. James and I were up early this morning, or at least midday, I guess, more in Guernsey, but making sure that this is working, and we're doing well so far. If this is your first webinar with the Circle of Cleft Professionals, welcome. We're delighted that you're with us. And as a quick reminder, we have 3 goals of this circle. One is to facilitate collaboration and networking among cleft professionals, especially people who are working in multidisciplinary teams, and especially in resource-constrained contexts. We want to communicate the impact in learning, and I think we'll have a chance to talk after James's presentation about, especially about face equality, how that looks in our own environments, in our own contexts. And we definitely want to be of support. So even today, as I was reviewing, had a sneak peek, I guess, at what James will be presenting today, thinking through my own response as someone who has some stake in comprehensive cleft care in the Global South, thinking, well, how do I approach this idea of face equality? So our hope is that you'll have that similar ability to think through and support your own team's growth in the coming weeks. Yeah, we'll move on. So today, our agenda, we've done a quick welcome and a COCP update. We'll hear from James in a second. As always, we'll have lots of time for questions and discussion, and we'll be finished within an hour. So thank you for carving out some time during your workday to think and network together around the world. And we'll talk a little bit more about where we're going next, which is in April, and focusing on pre-surgical care, and we'll hear more about that near the end. All right, well, without further ado, we'll just run through who are we. So we're already up to 157 members, over 25 countries, many of whom are represented today, 13 plus specialties who have an interest in comprehensive cleft care, which is wonderful. And our sponsors, who we're so delighted to have, are many of the major cleft players, people who are supporting internationally comprehensive cleft care. And we're delighted to have leaders present to us on a monthly basis, and also recommend to their teams that they're in contact with that they join us and share of the learning and questions that they have. So thank you again to our international charity sponsors. So without further ado, you've seen our postcard. We do have James Partridge on the line today. He's the director of Face Equality International. Many of you will have been familiar with his work as the founder and chief executive of Changing Faces, and that was from 1992 to about 2017. He's now on the island of Guernsey, from what I understand, although I'm sure making some somewhat regular trips back to England, etc. This new network, which we'll hear all about, has been formed somewhat recently and has really gathered a lot of steam in terms of sponsors, in terms of participants around the world. Just before we started the webinar officially, there was a global conference planned that I think has been disrupted now by the coronavirus, but will still happen in a virtual format. But we're delighted to hear James talk today a little bit more about face equality, and as all of us have a stake in health, being health professionals and options for action, we're delighted to hear some of these challenges and how we can move forward. So, James, we'll pass the baton over to you. If you hit that share button on your Zoom screen, we should be able to transition, with our fingers crossed, over to your own PowerPoint, and we'll hear from you for the next 25 minutes or so.
Yeah, I'm hoping, but it says you cannot start screen share while, so, okay. So let's see if I can do share now.
You're doing well so far.
And here it comes. And so I am going to go onto this form.
Yes.
And I need to go back a couple of slides here. Here we go.
Hey, that was perfect. All right, I'm gonna turn off my video and listen, but well done, James.
I hope everybody is able to see and that I'm speaking at a reasonably good volume. Do shout if I'm not.
It sounds great from this side, James.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak to you. This is a really important circle that you have, and I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Faith Equality International and the work that we're doing, and I'm hoping to learn a lot from you, as well as giving you some ideas about what we are up to. Brief outline, I'm going to just describe who I am and what we do, and what Faith Equality International is about. Then I'm going to look at what Faith Equality means and why we are concentrating on it. And then we'll move on to what this means for health professionals and some of the issues. And I don't think I'm going to come up with a whole series of answers for you, but I hope that I'll be able to raise some ways in which you may be able to approach some of the issues that are raised here. So without further ado, I'll plow in. I'm hoping to finish by 1/2 the hour. So I'll be galloping a little bit, but hope to make as much time for questions as possible. So who am I? Yes, Hugh's just said I set up a charity called Changing Faces in the UK, and I now run this Faith Equality International. My background is in economics. I then did a public health master's. Actually, I was a dairy farmer for some years, but from 1992 onwards, I was really majoring in psychology, health psychology, health policy, and of course in social change. So it's a fairly eclectic background, but I hope that what I will say will be of interest without being too jargonized, shall we say. So that's me, and Faith Equality International was created. I hope you can see that second slide, just checking, Hugh.
Yes, sure. That looks great. Everything's great.
Okay, thank you. Faith Equality International created in November 2018, and it's an alliance of NGOs and charities. We don't at the moment have individual membership, nor indeed associate membership, but we're looking at both of those options. So we are really a global alliance of NGOs and charities which support people with facial differences of any kind. I think it's useful here just to say a little bit about the language. We are going to use the phraseology facial difference and probably facial disfigurement as collective terms for people who, to describe the visual effect of conditions that affect people's faces. And it's important that we are, as an alliance, we're representing people with facial differences of many different sorts. So I've clearly got the aftermath of burn injuries experienced many years ago, 50 years ago. You're obviously talking about your patients, clients who have clefts of various sorts, but we're also representing people with skin conditions like psoriasis and eczema, vitiligo and other conditions like that, people with facial cancer, with birthmarks, facial paralysis of various sorts, Bell's palsy and so on. So there are, and I should say some of the rarer conditions too, like Meabius syndrome. So there are very many different causes of facial difference, and the NGOs in this alliance are supporting and representing people with many different facial differences. And our aim, our aim is very straightforward, really. It's to raise awareness of what we would call facial stigma and discrimination. We want to argue for legal protection. We want to challenge facial prejudice, and we want to make sure that people have what we would call face equality. And what does that mean? Well, here are all these sorts of people that we're talking about. Pictures mostly in the developed world, but also very much in low income, resource constrained settings. People have these experiences wherever they live in the world. So there isn't a matter of saying, you know, this particularly affects people in these areas. This is cross-culture, cross-income, all across demography. And what is face equality? Well, face equality is about being treated fairly and equally, irrespective of facial appearance. We want to create a society in which everyone is valued for the unique contribution that they can make. It's got great parallels with race equality, I think, and gender equality too, but you can think of it as an equality human rights issue, I think. Moving on to what the evidence is for why we need face equality in the campaign. The evidence of people's experiences who have facial differences is thin, and it is almost all anecdotal. But here is perhaps the biggest survey that's been conducted. In 2017, Changing Faces did a UK-based survey. 800 people answered the questionnaire, and some of the comments were so stark that they were definitely demonstrating why the campaign for face equality needed to be created. I'm not going to go through all of these, but it was clear that many people with facial differences were experiencing unpleasantness from strangers. They were experiencing an impact on their education, their aspirations, their careers. They felt vulnerable on public transport, and that social media was a particularly difficult zone, and that dating websites and similar things like that are really tricky areas for people with facial differences to use. This is clearly UK, and we did a further study of public attitudes, not the views of people with facial differences, but those who don't have facial differences. And this implicit attitude test that we did in 2008 was another stark recognition that, as it says on the screen, 9 out of 10 people, members of the public, found it very hard to associate positive characteristics with somebody who has a facial disfigurement. So being successful, having a fun life, being happy or good to spend time with. This was problematic. 10 years on, in 2017, with the campaign for face equality rolling out in the UK, we had got this down to 7 out of 10, but it's a long way to go. The bias, and really important here, the unwitting bias that people have is, we believe, endemic, and it's endemic not just in Britain, but around the world. Where do these problems arise? Our view is that face equality is, facial stigma and prejudice is endemic in our culture, global culture. And I've got 3 slides here which give sort of a simple diagnosis, if you will, of the messages in our visual diet. Here's the first message: you need to look good in order to have success. And if you don't, you're likely to live a sad and second-rate life and are probably worthy of charity and sympathy. These are such familiar images. We see them all over billboards and particularly throughout social media. This is a phenomenon. The look good culture is absolutely global. The second message is that surgery is a magnificent way of fixing disfigurement, and really cosmetic surgeons are geniuses, and really you should, if you have a facial difference, go and have as much surgery as it takes, even perhaps with a face transplant. Now, don't get me wrong here, surgeons are absolutely fantastic, and all the teams and clinical teams that go in towards making people's faces look less unusual and more, or less noticeable and more aesthetically, quote, normal. But the magic message that is conveyed in too many medias across many countries is a very stark one for people with facial differences to need to deal with. And the third message is that somehow facial scarring, asymmetry is associated with villainy, nastiness. These images that we see in the movies particularly are taken almost for granted as, oh, this is perfectly okay. Well, we think that these are tired portrayals, that it's really important that we move on into 21st century face values. And we need to challenge Hollywood and Bollywood and all those film industries not to adopt such lazy stereotyping. So those are the three kind of what we would call facist prejudices that are unconscious in our daily lives, that somebody with a facial difference is almost inevitably going to live a slightly second-rate life. Sad, really. Critical, actually, in that, if I just go back to that first point, one of the biggest problems that we hear about at Face Equality International is the low expectations that people feel and children are exposed to. The sense of, well, you know, it'll be good if you can get a little job. It'll be good if you can get a little bit further on, but please, you know, keep your expectations down. If you have a disfigurement, that's going to be difficult. The second, as I've said, is the surgery, and the third is about being odd, scary, and nasty if you have a different looking face. All of these have nasty effects, and this is a general slide about the kinds of what we would call facial discrimination that people report. And top of the list, actually, I should just stress, unwitting and unintentional. Yeah, these are often not malign and nasty, although sometimes they can be. Top of the list, actually, is uncontrolled staring, or the reverse, non-staring, non-looking. Those are two tricky zones that people respond to, but name calling and ridicule, pointed jokes, excessive sympathy, the use of stigmatizing vocabulary, we might come back to this, it's really tricky if you have a facial difference not to feel that somehow people are talking about you in less than what should we say, polite and objective terms. Bullying and ostracism. Social media is a very nasty zone for people to experience, you know, bad responses, trolling, and so on. And of course, in the job market, sadly, we are still experiencing and seeing job descriptions that make comments about appearance that really don't give fair treatment to people with facial differences. So that's the sort of position that we're coming from. And I'm glad to say that the Alliance is very much about driving forward the campaign to draw attention to these issues and also try to seek change. And the sort of way that we're doing this is through public awareness, through holding International Face Equality Weeks. Please, there's one coming up in May. I'd be very keen to publicize that to you and right across your circle. And we're doing all sorts of other things which I won't go into at this stage, but it's important to see that there are a whole raft of activities that we want to engage in. But of course, we're a tiny alliance and we aren't able to do all of this at this stage. The great thing is that we find that when we talk to, shall we say, employers and businesses, there are often moments of, you know, those, oh, wait a second, the light bulb moment. Yeah, wait a second, I haven't really thought about this before. I have a classic case about the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I spoke to somebody at the UN about this and they said, oh yes, yeah, I'm not sure that we've actually come across facial disfigurement as an issue before. And I said, well, you need to. Something like 1 in 100, 1 in 150 people around the world is going to experience a facial difference at some time in their life. And for most of them, it'll be a permanent thing. So that's where we're coming from. I hope that's helpful to give you a bit of background. Do go and visit the website. So what does this mean for health professionals? Well, I'm sure that in your own practice, you have challenges, and I'd obviously be keen to hear and share anything that I can. Having run Changing Faces for a long time, we had a lot of engagement with health professionals, and I think what I'm going to say here is really mostly to do with my learning from that, although it has to be said that 1 or 2 of the Face Equality International members are now getting involved in trying to raise awareness in their culture. So let me just take the sort of key issues, as far as I'm concerned, under 3 headings, if I may. The first is the awareness of the impact of facism on the child and family. And I think we should look at that in 3 sort of ways. I think there is a very important issue for you all, and indeed for your clinical teams, to reflect on whether you, and I'm not trying to point fingers here, but how far are you aware of the, shall we say, the conditioning that you have grown up with? Are you conscious of the kind of position that your clients are and patients are liable to experience in their life outside your hospitals? I think it's very important that health professionals reflect on their own position on this. Many people will say, yeah, but I don't have those sorts of opinions. I'm sure I don't. Well, I just ask you to take a deep think about that, please. The second is the issue of language. The way that facial difference, and indeed cleft lip and palate in particular, is spoken about in your clinics, in your hospital, and particularly with families who are about to have surgery or are recovering from it, is so important in our view. It doesn't, for me, go down very well to hear the use of what I completely respect is medical language, the language that uses words like deformity, anomaly, malformation. All of those sorts of words can, in a different social context, outside the medical jargon, outside the medical setting, can feel very difficult for the child and the family to deal with. So we recommend the use of words like, you have a facial condition. Now that's an entirely objective phrase. It doesn't say this is a bad condition or a difficult or anything like that. It just says you have a medical condition, and it's called a cleft lip and palate or whatever it is. And using that language, you can in that way help the family to use it too. Because I think you'll all know of how these conditions like cleft lip and palate and burns too can become so tricky for the family to deal with. And language is one way in which we can normalize these conditions and make them far less awful, socially awful particularly. And the third area is that our view is that somehow there needs to be a real whole team approach to these issues. In Britain, we developed a training pack for burn care teams that brought out these sorts of issues and enabled the teams as a whole, right across, you know, from the tea lady all the way through to the surgeon, to have an understanding of how important it was to use the right language, to be able to pick up the impact of racism on the family and child affected, and to agree a clinical team approach, really not anything other than a completely united team effort on this. So that would be those would be my first thoughts on how to raise awareness of racism and the importance of doing it. The second heading I had was the ability and the skills to monitor the effects, to assess, to screen for the effects. Now, I suspect that in many of your settings, the existence of psychologists and others in your multidisciplinary team is fairly small. We have argued in the Western setting that psychologists should be an integral part of a multidisciplinary team dealing with cleft lip and palate. But often that isn't possible, but that shouldn't mean that nobody can take responsibility, and it means leadership in your teams for screening families for the effects of racism. This needn't be a very detailed, hugely scientific effort. There are some quite straightforward questions that can be asked at the right time. But of course, for somebody to take leadership also means that they imbue the rest of the team with the ways in which they can be active in this way. The other point about this is that in terms of taking action to mitigate the effects of racism, it's not the case that every one of your clinical team should have an action plan of what to do. It's not appropriate for people who are perhaps in the operating theatre to be involved in helping the family to prepare for going back to school or whatever it is. The important thing is that the actions that you set as a team are suitable for the skills of your team and your staff. So we know that, for example, the support back into the community can be done obviously by the social work or similar skills, but they often also can involve volunteers and perhaps NGOs that you're working with. So it's important to grade the actions appropriately. And thirdly, what sort of tools do you have to screen for the effects? Here I would think that some simple questionnaires can be useful, but often it's simply making sure that at clinic level, somebody is asking the right question. And that might not be the surgeon. It may be the nurse. It may be somebody else in your team is asking questions relevant to the child's age and development that will try to assess how exposed that child is to the effects of fascism. So to give you a very simple example, if you as a clinical team are sitting around and the whole focus is on the child and somebody says, so are you being bullied at school? The chances are the child will say, no, I'm not, and no problem. And the family may say that too, because nobody really wants to own up. But it can be very important that in a smaller setting, perhaps a one-to-one setting, actually given the chances, the parent or the child will say, well, yes, and it's not getting any easier, and I tend not to go to school, or I tend to avoid playgrounds, or whatever it is. The effects of fascism are very subtle, and sometimes they're very painful, and it takes a lot for children and families to own up to them and to identify them. And part of the reason is because they don't know that there's anything that can be done. And I don't want to go on to this too much, but there are interventions that can be made available. And I'm not going to go into this in any detail because I can see the time marching, but at Changing Faces, and indeed you can go and look at this on the Changing Faces website, there are what we would call the FACES principles that should guide or can guide interventions to help children and families. I'm just going to put these principles up on the next slide. This slide will be available to everybody, so you don't feel you need to capture it. But what we found was that we had to find ways of enabling children and families to have these 5 options available to them. They needed to find out about their condition and become experts. They needed to get a positive attitude towards it. They needed to cope with their feelings of anger and so on. They needed to exchange experiences with others, or many did. Some didn't want to do that, but many did. And last, and perhaps most importantly, they needed to develop the social skills to manage others' reactions. And just to point you to the second point here, there are some very good digital resources available now. Self-help guides are available, and I could send after this meeting some web links on the Changing Faces website, particularly of self-help guides that have been written very straightforwardly for families to help their children, and indeed for teachers too. So it's worth somebody in your team finding out these digital resources and seeing if they can be made available. Perhaps not digitally, perhaps printed out, perhaps translated, but in some way. And the third thing is the potential signposting to NGOs and charities. I've put a rather important little caveat here. I think we all know that it's really important to pre-vet, to screen charities, to check that they have very sound processes, because sadly in this world we know that there are some rogues around, and I don't want to say that too seriously, but signposting to NGOs is a really important way for some children and families to get the empowerment they need. So those were my thoughts. I'm sorry I've gone over my time slightly, but I hope that can start a conversation. Maybe those 3 areas will be a useful structure on which to hang it.
Thank you, James. Fantastic. And
Thank you.
your timing is great. So we'll.
Should I get out of this? Should I get out of this screen now? What do you think?
Well, we will share back to our PowerPoint here. You should see that in a second. So here we go. We're back.
Okay.
If this is your first time, welcome. We got a great turnout this morning, this afternoon, or this evening. I think probably Northern Thailand is the latest in the evening, so people have stayed up very late, but I think we've got our money's worth. Thank you, James. But if this is your first time as part of a webinar, we do have a good 25 minutes or so to discuss. James has given us several cues for how we could think about this in terms of resource-constrained settings as well. How does some of these issues of face equality impact your own practice in your own country? And what really brought up some good ideas to think about for you? So you can participate in a variety of ways. You can turn on your webcam if you'd like to show that you would like to ask a question. You can send me as a private chat or chat to everyone your question, and I can read it for you. But we'll give everyone a second to think about what their response is. And I can see even on my own chat log right now, people have been very engaged so far, James, in thinking about how this has gone. So we have James here. Let's take advantage of this, and I'll open it up for some questions. I see one coming in now as people are thinking. James, I think the first thing that came for me, I think, in encountering the Face Equality National Alliance was the importance of language, and giving us some cues as to what is the most appropriate language. I'd like to see, so I've got Kathy to Toronto says, we use the term facial difference. Do you feel this is an appropriate term? So James, can you comment a little bit more about this idea of language, as it relates to cleft lip and palate, but even, facial differences in general? How did you come across this language, and what would be some of your thoughts on this?
I certainly think that that use of facial difference in North America is very common and very accepted. I think in Europe and in Britain and in some other countries, the word difference is a little bit of a euphemism, and we're not so keen on euphemisms. And in particular, I have had some resistance to it in terms of creating legal protection. And the advantage of using the word disfigurement as an alternative to difference is that it points to the disadvantage that is experienced by children with clefts and adults with other facial conditions. The problem with facial difference in legal terms is that everybody has a facial difference, and it's not very specific to the particular problem that the community that I'm representing has. So while I understand facial difference, and it is of course an inclusive term which has a lot to say, a lot of advantage, I like the inclusiveness of it. I also think that there are times when facial disfigurement is better. Can I just say one other thing? There is also a move in some places to use the term visible difference as another generic term. And again, I have some problem with visible difference because frankly, every single human being has a visible difference. And although therefore it's great because it just shows that people who may have alopecia or has an unusual facial condition from a congenital condition, we're all part of the human race. It's not particularly helpful in enabling us to argue for not special treatment, but for fairness and respect.
Thank you, James. I think that's very helpful. We did have another question from northern Thailand, about even the term cleft lip and palate. So the question is, what would be a proper term to use with families and patients? And I know, we struggle with this at Transforming Faces, in particular in South America, where, and I know we have many from South America on the call that can attest to this, but sometimes even in appropriate definitions or in dictionaries, you can still find the term hair lip or, rabbit face, as being the accepted term. I think in North America, even the idea of a hare being a rabbit is kind of diminished a little bit. But so obviously this term can be quite contested, and is something that is of interest, I think, to a lot of our partners around the world.
I think it's really important that we move away from hair lip, primarily because that echoes an era of old wives' tales and mythologies that really we need to completely put in the dustbin of history. There's actually a very good book that's just come out called Disfigured, by a woman called, I won't necessarily get her right, but Amanda Leduc, Leduc, and it's called Disfigured, and it's about the way in which myth can really dominate thinking and conditioning around disability and disfigurement. I would therefore really urge you not to use hair lip, because I think cleft lip and palate, although it may be new language for some families, is an objective description. And just to give you an example, I know somebody whose son had a mild form of polio as a child, and they were unable as a family for years to talk about this boy has polio or has had polio. They would just refer to his legs. And it was so unhelpful for the child and their peers, and the family were kind of trying to hide from the fact that this child had a condition. And okay, that is the reality. And I feel the same about cleft lip and palate. We need to make sure that it's brought out into the mainstream and understood as it happens. 1 in 700 children are born with a cleft lip and palate. It's part of life.
Thank you, James. And one of our participants has pointed out that even on the WHO website in Spanish, they still use hair lip, as an official term. So I think there's some work to do for the Face Equality Alliance in terms of supporting some of our Spanish-speaking partners. James, you brought up an interesting point, and it's echoed by our partner in Bangalore, Dr. Giant. Just that idea of how professionals can use terms that are clinically accurate in a clinical setting, but also equip parents to use terms that are potentially more accessible or appropriate outside of that. Can you comment a little bit about this idea of clinical accuracy as well as equipping parents?
I think this is a really difficult zone, because often clinical discussions have to be held with families present, quite understandably. But I think it is a very good discipline, if you are in those settings, to eliminate those medical jargon words that you might use in, shall we say, a medical conference, behind closed doors, or even in medical articles. I don't have a problem if you're writing for a medical journal, if you do use those phrases. Actually, I think it's very interesting to see some of the medical articles now being, we're going to have the little caveats. We're going to use this word condition to refer to da, 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 da. But I do think that the way that the clinical team talks about a condition, like a cleft lip and palate, very much influences how the family will talk about it, and how the child will talk about it when he or she is talking to their peers, and indeed how the whole community around the child deals with it. in the case of burns, there are many examples that I could cite where children have had to kind of own up to having burn scarring on their body, which, you know, seems, oh no, it's, I don't want to show it, I don't want to show it. And of course, it's not possible to get that to happen unless the clinical team are really honest and encouraging the family to accept that this is part of the process that they're going through. And I just get that word accept out here, because we know, and all of you know, that having a child with a cleft is a traumatic experience for families, and the process that they go through in grieving for their lost child and in accepting and really empowering their child is not an easy one. What we're hoping to do through this raising awareness of facial prejudice and discrimination is to help health professionals and indeed families to understand the kind of world which sadly people are having to emerge into and deal with. It's a long way before we get a world that respects face equality, but that doesn't mean that people can't be empowered to deal with their own experience.
Thank you, James. A question from Chennai, Suraj. Oh, Suraj, you seem to unmute. You need to unmute your microphone, Suraj. Sorry. We see your video.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you so much for an interesting topic. You know, this face equality took me back in time, and this is not something which was used to even before I came into this cleft professional. Being in India, we have two gods who have different faces, not a human-like face dog. Okay, so we are used to hear about different faces, but when we were taught, we were always taught about what are all the good qualities, what are the strength of that person, and all of that. But that is something which is not been transferred as a professional. And then we also see in our practice, somehow we are able to emotionally attune to the patient and the family and give the treatment. But when they go back to the community, starting from school, it's a very difficult thing. You know, I can educate, you know, how to educate the entire community. So there should be a program, you know, as you said, use of media and all of that. How do you envision to develop such a big program? What is your role? You know, how can people from different parts of the country, you know, be of some help in this big campaign?
Thank you, Suraj. It's just quite a small question, that one. I think it's incredibly difficult to see this happening quickly, but I think it's something that can start from small things, small activities. I know in some countries it's been about one hospital, one clinical team, starting to reach out to their community, and particularly the schools in their community, and the family associations, and starting to inform those families and those school settings, and then somebody else saying, but we want this in our neighborhood too, and in our neighborhood, and so it gradually spreads. But this isn't easy. I'm not kidding you. And I think that if I'm using the example in Britain, which is, you know, obviously an artificial example, it took us 10 years to really build up the awareness of face equality. And we needed, very interestingly, we needed a lot of role models to become public in the public domain, particularly in social media and so on. And we didn't get those. They were very, very slow to emerge. There are all sorts of prejudices in the media that sort of prevent people from being seen on screens. But there's something that's going on in India, which I think is really interesting at the moment, and that is around the community of acid survivors. And you may be conscious of them. And there are some extraordinarily powerful role models that are emerging, mostly women, from that community. And I'd encourage you to go and look at, there's a website called Stop Acid Attacks. And they have a very impressive campaign centered around a restaurant in, I think it's in Agra. But some of those women are now appearing as celebrities in fashion advertising and that sort of thing. It's got to happen that way. And I guess that you may well have some role models in your community, people who've been through cleft surgeries and come out the other side are powerful advocates for what they've achieved. And it's really about mobilizing them, working with them as a clinical team, maybe getting them in some way to stir up that sense of, you know, we can do this, and we need the wider public to be understanding and educated.
Thanks, James. And thank you, Suraj. There's 2 points I think that came up for me. One, I think that we've heard from a lot of our parents, James, it's helpful to hear you emphasize just the process of coming to grips with having a child born with cleft, and sort of some of the real emotional journey that parents go through. And I think the other thing that Suraj brought up was even some specific cultural reference points. So in India, he's mentioning, you know, you have gods with disfigurement or different faces. And in some contexts in which we work, we hear a lot about cultural beliefs about what causes cleft, you know, that has some culpability for parents, you know, or there is a curse involved or God's involved, and this is something. So I think, you know, as your face equality network continues to grow, I mean, I think there can be specific ways of engaging with beliefs that might be contextual to a particular country or a particular region that also are involved in getting over the stigma.
Absolutely, and I'm actually talking to some people in the Philippines at the moment where theft is it's very widespread, but it's also become far less stigmatized over the last decade or so. So, I mean, I think there are changes that can happen, but I think families are increasingly looking for that sense that the low expectations that so often surround the child and the family are not going to be imposed on them. That's the critical thing. And I think clinical teams can make a huge impact in imbuing that sense of you can do anything you want. I remember going to South Africa and going to a clinic in, it'll come back to me in a minute. But anyway, it was out in the bush, and it was extraordinary how powerful the clinical nurse was in ensuring that the child was asked questions about how they were finding school, and she was really questioning the family. Does this child go to school? Because it's crucial that school and learning and getting the skills and talents, you know, that's really part of the process. You can come here and get surgery, but really it's about skills, talents, and believing in the child and getting the child to be socially skilled too. So I'm sorry, I wish I had some magic tricks here, but I can't emphasize actually enough, and maybe I should have said more, that social skills development is so critical. And if you look at nothing else, if you go to the Changing Faces website, please do look at some of those self-help guides about how to meet others, how to deal with questions and staring, how to be assertive. Children need to grow with those skills as automatic.
That's really insightful. And it flipped a switch a little bit for me, the idea of coaching and really being transparent with families and with you know, children born with cleft lip and palate about the skills that they will need to be able to interact, to be able to be resilient, to be able to, you know, to channel someone's unhelpful behavior into a more helpful one in a way that feels empowering to them.
And often these are little tricks that don't take a lot of learning, but don't tell anybody that you've got them. You know, the skill to turn a nasty name calling incident into something that is just, it's no skin off my back. You know, moving on. No, I'm not called Scarface, I'm whatever it is. And those are such simple skills, but they're very powerful when learned.
Thank you. And
Marina
from
I'd
Chile,
be happy to send you, I'll send you the web link for those, those things.
And I think Marina from Chile is emphasizing again that focus on empowerment of both family and child is critical to having a successful outcome towards full inclusion from a cleft lip and palate. There is a question also, you mentioned a big focus in the media coming up. And so a question from Toronto was, will you be sharing Face Equality some resources that our partners can share with their own families coming up when we talk about face equality?
Definitely a really good question, and I'm glad you've asked it from Toronto, actually. You may know about Face in Toronto, and they are very much a partner in the Face Equality International Alliance. We're going to be increasingly working with them and other NGOs in North America as we come up to Face Equality Week, International Face Equality Week in May. And actually, About Face have got and are aiming to develop more and more resources for schools, for health professionals, and so on, to empower and to inform and educate. So advocacy is becoming more and more important, I think, for NGOs, and Face Equality International hopes to be that kind of resource to encourage that.
Wonderful. So I hear a few exhortations. One, definitely to check the Face Equality International website for some links. We'll also post on our Slack channel both the recording of this video. I've had a few surgeons reach out already and say they want to make sure that their social worker sees this webinar, which is amazing. So it can be viewed later on. But in the interest of time, I'll just move us on to saying, yes, so what happens next? And a big thank you to James for being so generous with his time and the stories that you shared.
It's a privilege to be in touch with you all. Thank you very much for joining.
Great. So we will post a recording of this so you can share with other members of your multidisciplinary team who might have missed it but would really appreciate James's presentation, even to know that this alliance is building. I mean, that's a very encouraging, empowering thing for our teams to know and something to share with the families with which we work. We are moving from Face Equality to next month talking about pre-surgical care, particularly an expert in NAM named Dr. Boris Iturriaga from Chile. So make sure you join us there. There will be an invitation coming through. And if you have other people who you'd like to invite, please encourage them to fill out our short application to join our network. There's no cost. And then further on in May, you know, there's been a researcher from Toronto who spent some time in Ethiopia assessing the health burden of cleft. So doing more of a medical/economic analysis. And again, moving, as James has talked about, to that point of advocacy. How do we use data that we've gathered to be able to advocate for changes within our countries in terms of health funding, in terms of acceptance, in terms of support to families dealing with issues such as cleft lip and palate. So that's coming up in May. Stay tuned for that. That's the end of our time today. I do definitely want to say thank you. We had a great turnout. I've seen lots of thank yous coming across the chat feature, so that's great. I'll just vocalize those for everyone else. And again, if you have any questions, if you want to know more about the Circle of Cleft Professionals, please send us an email at info@cleftcircle.org. And then definitely encourage you to check out the Face Equality International website. And I know James is very eager to meet new partners as this network continues to grow.